Another coup in West Africa. Soldiers in Niger have seized power and removed the democratically elected president. What does it mean for the fight against armed groups in the Sahel? And how do recurrent military takeovers cripple democracy in Africa? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. Niger's President Mohamed Bazoum was elected 2 years ago in the first peaceful democratic transfer of power since independence in 1960. But on Wednesday, members of his own presidential guard removed him from office. The coup leaders say they want to prevent further economic and security problems. Niger's neighbours, Mali and Burkina Faso, have seen 4 military takeovers since 2020. So what does this mean for Western countries who have increasingly relied on Niger as a base of operations against armed groups in the Sahel? And with the Wagner Group mercenaries already active in several African nations, will these developments increase Russia's influence on the continent? We'll be discussing all of this in a few moments with our guests, but first, this report from Victoria Gatenby.
Soldiers surround Niger's national television station in the capital, Niamey, as well as the residence of President Mohamed Bazoum. Hours later, they announced the president's removal.
We, the Security Defence Forces, gathered at the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, have decided to put an end to the regime you know. This follows the continuous deterioration of the security situation and poor social and economic management.
The United Nations, African Union, Regional Bloc ECOWAS and the United States have all demanded Bazoum's reinstatement.
The United States resolutely supports him as the democratically elected president of Niger. We call for his immediate release. We condemn any effort to seize power by force.
Bazoum's inauguration 2 years ago was the first peaceful transfer of power between democratically elected leaders since the country gained independence from France in 1960. When Al Jazeera spoke to Bazoum last year, he was optimistic about the future.
I think the difficulties are behind us. We succeeded in a democratic change of power. I symbolize a hope, simply a hope for the end of the ethnic issues and the relationship to power.
Niger is one of the world's poorest nations. For decades it struggled with drought and food shortages, which has led to unrest and ethnic conflict. But more recently, Niger has faced another challenge, the rise of armed groups and an increase in attacks in the Sahel region. Frustrations about the worsening insecurity has been a driving force for coups. Neighbouring Mali and Burkina Faso have seen 4 military takeovers in the past 3 years.
I think there's a real question that Washington has to be asking itself right now, if after all of this money and attention and engagement and assistance, if we cannot keep Niger on a democratic path, then what are we doing wrong?
Since Mali and Burkina Faso ordered foreign troops to leave last year, France and the US have increasingly relied on Niger as a base of operations against ISIL and al-Qaeda affiliates. Russian mercenaries are also active in the Sahel. The consequences of the coup will be felt far beyond Niger's borders, raising doubts about the resilience of democratic governments in a region plagued by instability. Victoria Gatenby for Inside Story.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now in the Nigerian capital of Abuja is Kabir Adamu, the managing director of Beacon Consulting, a security risk management and intelligence firm that operates in the Sahel. In Paris is Nicholas Norbrook, the managing editor of the Africa Report magazine, which covers Pan-African politics and business. And in London, Alex Vines, director of the Africa programme at Chatham House. A warm welcome to all of my guests. Thanks for joining us here on Inside Story. Kabir Adamu, can I come to you first in Abuja? Niger is not the first, and I doubt it's not going to be the last country to experience a coup in the region. They happen pretty often. But what's going wrong here?
Thank you. What the coup plotters have announced as their reasons, they've mentioned 2 things, security and the economy. However, the reality of what we see in both Niger and other countries is that when the military take over, they are not able to address these two issues. In terms of what is actually happening on ground, sadly, the Sahel region and most parts of West Africa are being afflicted by different threat elements, especially the influence of non-state armed groups that are ideologically based. So in particular, there are several ideological groups that are affiliated with the global terrorist groups, IS, Islamic State, that of Al-Qaeda. And Niger is not, spared out. It also has its own share of influence of these groups. So to an extent, yes, security is a challenge. And then, of course, the economy too. The influence, what happened after COVID-19, and then, of course, the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine are being felt by countries in the Sahel and West Africa. So all of these are realities. But sadly, the claim that the military will be in a better position to address that has not been factual.
Indeed, and we'll delve into that as we continue with the conversation. Nicholas Norbrook in Paris, let's just start with the initial rumours of the appointment of a new presidential guard, which seems to have been the flashpoint for the coup or the rebellion, however we want to describe it. It seems to have spread much wider to the military, to a full-blown coup. Is that a fair assessment, that this was simmering all the time, or it has come as a complete shock?
I think it came as a shock to President Bazoum. Even last night, he was sending us text messages saying the other elements of the army will be here soon. It's just the presidential guard which is involved in this coup. So I think he and a lot of other people are fairly surprised at the widespread nature of it. We understand elements of the police are involved, as well as most of the army, and of course, this presidential guard, which ironically has had a great deal of a great deal of investment put into it over the last few decades to try and stave off the coup attempts which have plagued Niger since it gained its independence in the 60s.
So let's cross over to Alex Vines, and we'll develop that, because obviously, it's interesting, isn't it? You invest so much in your military and in your security because you are a big player in the region to try and not just defend your own country, but your borders. And that very group of people, Alex, turn on you. Are you surprised at the way things have happened so very quickly?
No, we've seen a pattern here. So you're absolutely right. One of the problems in the Sahelian area is that there's been a lot of investment in security. And so building up presidential guards, I mean, you can call them Praetorian guards. The presidential guard in Niger is 2,000 strong. And so the unintended consequence is that the one institution that is well-resourced and is better trained is the military, and particularly the kind of elite units. And the unintended consequences is that you turn fragile straits into brittle ones, and you start to get a very frustrated broader population and interest groups encouraging the military to stage a coup. Now, they all claim they're for peace, security, fair play, justice, and equity. But what we're also seeing, and there's a very good UNDP report that was launched 2 weeks ago that interviewed 8,000 people across these countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where there's been coups, on what people actually want ultimately. And it is about a better economy. It's about better security. The only good news is that the end goal is better democracy. But the interviews show a lot of buyer's remorse because, as your previous speaker said, the military is just not equipped to provide better security long term, and certainly not democracy.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about security and democracy and certainly finances just a little bit later. One more question to Kabir Adamu about sort of the current situation, the swiftness of the coup. I mean, you heard Alex there saying he wasn't surprised from the analysis that Chatham House has. From where you are in Abuja and in West Africa, is Nigeria surprised by what's going on?
Yeah. I mean, given the statement by the president, who is the current chairman of ECOWAS, immediately after the news emerged, he issued a statement. He followed that by sending out a delegation. So yeah, it appears he is surprised. And I mean, there is discussion also around what has been described as the colossal failure of intelligence. I mean, those putting that forward talked about Sudan, how Sudan happened, and it appears the intelligence capabilities of not just African countries, but Western countries too, were either unaware or were caught off guard. So the same thing with this development in Niger. It appears that the state institutions and the backdoor channels that the intelligence platforms represent were probably not aware or not ready for such a development, and that's why we saw a visit from an fellow ECOWAS leader to the Nigerian president, and then the result of that was a delegation. But more significantly was the inability of the delegation that was sent by the president to prevent the total collapse of the government in Niger, and more importantly, to also secure the release of the elected president, because as it were, he's still in detention at the moment. So yeah, it appears the Nigerian state and the ECOWAS chair, because of course it's the Nigerian president that is occupying that, were unawares of that the development in Niger.
Sure. Nicholas, let's go back to you in Paris. I mean, corruption, greed, the temptation of absolute power, and the phrase absolute power corrupts. I mean, what is it that attracts the military to think they can do a better job than democratically elected officials, be they good or bad? They are still democratically elected by the people.
It's a tough one. Just to pick up on a previous point on the failure of intelligence, it's all the more surprising when the man who's believed to be behind this putsch, General Abdurrahman Chiani, who is the head of this Praetorian Guard, presidential guard that we've been speaking about, he's known about. He's a known quantity. And when President Bazoum's successor, Issoufou, was about to hand over the presidential chair, 2 days before the inauguration, there was an attack on the presidency. And there were rumors that this General Chiani was behind it then, rumors which have never really been dispelled. So it is surprising that Niger intelligence, that partner intelligence agencies have not been able to catch it. In terms of what these military elites believe they're doing, it's very hard to tell. But it does seem that the consequences for their actions are not really being felt, or at least they don't feel much deterrence, either from Western partners who have poured in a lot of cash. And there was a visit in February, I believe, by UK Minister for Africa. There was a visit by Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, in March. In April, the German defense minister was there. So there's been an incredible amount of money poured into the military, but no deterrence felt from there. And no deterrence felt from the region. There was a time when Nigeria was considered the gendarme of West Africa. That's no longer the case, clearly.
No, it isn't. I mean, Alex Vines, as you analyse the way we've seen so many coups in that region in the last 4 to 5 years, we think of Mali, we think of Burkina Faso. I mean, where do groups like ECOWAS and the African Union stand in sort of trying to encourage nation building? Yes, they may be focused on the economy, they may be focused as groups that deal with the politique of countries, but they also have a responsibility to maintain that level of hope of democracy, don't they? Hope of bringing countries forward post-colonial periods.
Yeah, so it's definitely a concern. As you mentioned, since 2020, we've had 7 coups and 3 attempted coups. Those are really confirmed ones, and maybe a bunch of others. I would kind of say that ECOWAS is trying, we've got a new Tinubu administration, so a new Nigerian president who has a vision for the region, cares about his near abroad, is looking at how he rebuilds the regional economic community. I was in Abuja myself only a couple of weeks ago. There was a summit about these particular issues. They were really concerned about Niger in particular, as well as Burkina Faso and what to do with Mali. So I wouldn't say there's been a complete intelligence failure here. There were concerns around elite disputes inside Niger, particularly between the current president, President Bazoum, and his predecessor, President Oussoufou, who was much more closely aligned with General Omar Chiani. I'm not sure I agree that Chiani was involved in the attempt of the March 2021 coup. I think he actually stopped it. Going forward, it's about how can the economic community of West African states become more effective, more efficient, and really not just be condemning coups, but with words, but actually with actions. And I think that's what's been drawn out really urgently now with Niger, because Niger is not just strategic and important for the West. It's equally important for Nigeria. And so a lot of focus is now being put onto how to convince the putschists to back down, basically. That's what's going on right at the moment.
Kabir Adamu in Abuja, the modus operandi, certainly, of the situation seems to reflect what we've seen in the region. I'll ask Nicholas the same sort of the answer to this question as well, but I'll start with you, Kabir, first. It starts off, and I'm just going to quickly, briefly summarise it. Military takeover, borders close. Military officers address the nation. Regional bodies like the AU condemn the coup. Sanctions are put in place, delegations sent in to talk, delegations free the president, who goes into exile, military remain in power, promise elections that never really happen openly. Regional bodies lift sanctions, Western countries that condemn the action restore diplomatic and economic relations. The end. It seems to be going partly to script.
Exactly, and I think this is just to relate it to your earlier question on what kind of the incentive for these military officers to take over government. Sadly, we haven't seen any consequences in almost all the 6, coups that have happened from 2020 till date. We haven't seen any direct consequences on the.
Nicholas, can I bring you in here in Paris? I mean, you were smiling at what I had to say, but I think that's the reality, isn't it? This is what we've seen repeated again and again. Alex is also nodding in agreement, so I think we're all on the same page here.
Absolutely. The script you outlined is eerily accurate. And I don't know if there's any shortcuts to it. I wouldn't remove agency, though, from those delegations. And I absolutely take the point that the Tinubu administration may have much more force than the Buhari administration, which ran Nigeria for the previous 8 years, had. But certainly when President Obasanjo was in charge and Nigeria was very comfortable projecting military force in the region, that script wasn't really adhered to. And sometimes coup plotters found themselves chased violently out of office, which, while you can't, allow violence of any sort, that kind of sense that there might be retribution, did carry a certain kind of weight in the region for a few years. So we can only hope that we will see a different script emerge, and that local actors, don't forget, Nigeria is 2/3 of the economy of West Africa. It is a serious player. Yeah. And if Nigeria's foreign policy becomes much more muscular, I think maybe that script can be flipped.
Yeah, Alex, you were nodding in agreement as well through that.
The big difference that you've got a lot more ambition, that basically the new Nigerian foreign policy of Tinubu that's being drawn up at the moment is a robust response against putschists. There's one thing that Tinubu and the incoming officials that are beginning to emerge around him that they have common vision, and that's they don't like military dictatorships. They all learnt their craft when they're dealing with opposing the Abacha administration in Nigeria. So this is a very different Nigeria, and I think this is where the putschists in Niamey may have miscalculated. The big neighbor next door is going to be a lot more proactive and a lot more influential than Western partners, be they France, EU, or the United States.
If we look at the region itself and the countries that surround Niger, Bazoum took power, 2 years ago, and with military coups happening around the region, the fallout of Libya's civil war, coups in Mali and Burkina Faso, even Chad, very unstable. These were all external security challenges that his country had to deal with. But there were internal ones too, but were they that evident? Nicholas?
It's hard to see whether they had got to that kind of level. The handover between Issoufou and Bazoum was held up at the time as being a real breakthrough for the region. At the time, there was a lot of attempts to rewrite constitutions in many Sahel countries to allow a third term for presidential people in the presidency. And Niger's Issoufou said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go on forever. I've had my 2 terms. I'm even going to designate who I would like in my party to succeed me, my defense minister, Bazoum. And so when that handover went over relatively well, a lot of people were pretty heartened for the region. I'll tell you something else which happened in 2021.
Just very quickly.
That was the death of President Idriss Déby, who had been France's gendarme for security in the region, doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Niger was the only one today, since that has turned in on itself, Niger is the only one doing that role. So now there are huge question marks.
Kabir, let's bring you back in here from Abuja. Let's talk about security and move the conversation on now. We've got a good sense of what's going on in Niger. We're seeing Western forces being pulled out of countries, security partners in Mali, for example. The US is, you might even say, on the back foot. So is France, dealing with the insurgencies across the Sahel and trying to help its African friends. We're seeing Russia come in as an alternative to the failures of various military operations. How do you assess the situation right now in terms of the importance of Niger, where the US and France do have troops?
So the geopolitics of, the Western nations is playing out in Africa in very clear terms. And sadly, we're seeing both state institutions and non-state actors. Wagner has been mentioned severally. And even in the Nigerian coup, there has been suggestion that there are actors at play that may be affiliated with some of these countries. And if I'm going to give a prognosis, this is likely to be the scenario over the next few years. There has also been suggestion that perhaps because of the attention of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that type of interest has dwindled from a geostrategic point in Africa, especially the Sahel region, where the two global terrorist affiliates have been growing. That's IS and Al Qaeda. And so it's this type of impact and consequence on security that we're seeing over time. But at the top of all of this, the umbrella that ties all of this is good governance and its lack of it within the region. So much has happened institutionally and structurally that has allowed this type of development that leads to coup. And I think, sadly, both the multilateral, regional, and global institutions, we've discussed ECOWAS, AU as well, do not speak enough around good governance. The lack of peer review and then action to disallow leaders who sadly are not serving enough of their people, I think allows this type of developments like what we're discussing in Niger.
OK, well, let me go back to Alex Vines in London, because there seems to be an opportunity here, Alex, while Niger is in flux and Wagner and Russia, as well as the US and France, vie for security supremacy in helping their African partners. There is a conference going on right now in St. Petersburg between Russia and African nations, and I can't help but think that they will be discussing this behind closed doors. Is this an opportunity for President Putin?
Well, we'll see. So I received a Twitter photo, or X photo, as it's called now, of Mr. Prigozhin, the chief of Wagner, meeting a particular ambassador in St. Petersburg as part of a fringe meeting. And Putschist leaders are invited in St. Petersburg. So, you've got the Burkina Faso and Mali represented there. The president of Guinea-Bissau is there, and so on. And so clearly, the Russians are always looking for opportunity, and Mr. Prigozhin has announced that he will continue to focus on Africa, and he's clearly doing that today in St. Petersburg. Now, whether the incoming military putschists in Niamey will reach out to Russia, let's see. But they'll certainly find that the Russians are knocking on their door. The Russians were knocking very loudly on the door of the junta in Ouagadougou, the Burkina Faso junta. But up to now, that junta has said, no, thank you. We don't want Russia to be involved with us.
We are coming very closely to the end of our programme. Nicholas Norbrook, just briefly, I mean, there is such a thing as civil society in most countries, and one assumes that there is such a society in Niger too, who tried to support the president and faced gunfire. Where do you think the public stand now in Niger, and is there a voice, or has it been silenced?
I don't think there is the size of middle class that you see in Sudan. And so you wouldn't get something akin to the resistance committees that have been so effective in Sudan. But as you could see from the pictures yesterday, there were crowds who came out immediately in support of the president, who are not keen on seeing their country being dragged down the direction of their neighbors. And while there may have been a few Russian flags seen in some of the crowds yesterday, we're relatively sure that is opportunistic and doesn't indicate some kind of groundswell. It should be said that since February, Prigozhin's Lakhta project, which is a big disinformation on social media project run by Prigozhin's companies, that has already been spreading since February misinformation in Niger. So this is something which is absolutely on the radar of Moscow, and I'd be very surprised if they weren't going to try and at least take advantage of events.
Indeed, it's a fast-moving story and one that is still developing even as we speak. I'd like to thank all of my guests for joining me on this edition of Inside Story, to Kabir Adamo, Nicholas Norbrook and Alex Vines. And thank you too as well for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Now, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sahil Rahman, and the Inside Story team, thanks very much for your time and your company.